So thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody on the organizing team and our technology folks helping us get started today. It's really exciting to get to talk with folks outside my own campus right now. And I am going to be talking about 2SLGBTQ+ student success across multiple dimensions of identity and development and learning. And I want to talk just really briefly before we start for those who haven't sort of followed along, or honestly, some of you who are a little later to this process haven't been doing it for a million years. So I want to talk about where we were and where we are now. How has research on 2S LGBTQ+ college students evolved? Just a brief background. So first, there were in the maybe 1980s and early 90s, a lot of visibility studies. These were often first-person narratives, people talking about their experience as, at the time, probably more just gay and lesbian, before we were more open and inclusive of other identity groups, but narratives like what was my experience as a lesbian faculty member. We had some narratives written by college students themselves, but there was definitely a sense of we just need to build some visibility, like people need to know we're here, right? And there was then some visibility work emerging later, the early 2000s and on for the most part, about intersecting identities. So this is where we get a lot of studies or descriptive narrative writing about racialized minority students who are LGBTQ or students with disabilities who are LGBTQ. So we begin to get this kind of intersecting. So there's a lot of visibility research. This is sort of like we're here, we're queer research is what I call it. And it really has helped us as practitioners in higher education understand more about our students and who they are. So there's visibility research. And then of course there's campus climate research. And this started mostly in the 1990s, later 1990s, and has continued through. The summary of campus climate in general, and you'll learn a lot about this across these series of seminars, is the climate is getting better overall, right? But not getting better for everyone. And the progress is quite precarious. It can go forward and backward. This grand arc of it's all getting better all the time, I think is not actually what's happening. So we'll learn a lot about the campus climate elements of both the study in Ontario and then sort of nationwide in Canada and also in the US. Of course, there's a lot of studies, and I do some of these on identity development. So how people are developing their identities as 2S LGBTQ+ people. These are really important studies. A lot of them are being done using qualitative methods, so sometimes smaller samples. But thinking about how we come to be in the post-secondary environment, whatever kind of college or university, and how that helps us think about identity and identity development, how we can create ecosystems for positive, healthy development for students. And then there is a recent emphasis in the literature on separating sexual orientation and gender identity. So we're not just having studies of 2S LGBTQ+ students as a whole group. We're getting emerging work on trans students alone or bisexual students. Asexual student research is coming forward. So we're beginning to get a little more separation in the research, which I think is really helpful as we can get more specificity. And then more, of course, on intersecting identities. This is a great work being done sort of across the continent, and then people extending into thriving in student success. And so they're thinking about how we connect 2S LGBTQ+ college student research to other areas of what's going on in post-secondary education. So that's kind of the background of kind of where we were, where we are now. So we really are bringing ourselves to this moment of thriving, combining ideas around campus climate and identities and student outcomes all together to think forward about where we are, and then how we apply this to process, progress, programs, and policies, the 4 Ps. So I want to talk a little bit about studying college students in general, so not just LGBTQ 2S. There's a couple sort of common empirically sound approaches. One would be Alexander Aston, the late Dr. Aston, a fairly well-trod model called IEO, where you think about what are the inputs students bring with them, the experiences they have on campus, and what are the outcomes. It's a fairly straightforward way of thinking about inputs, environments, and outputs for college students. And then a lot of folks have begun to use developmental ecology models. And this is where my partnership with Michael has been so fruitful. Social work uses a lot of ecology models, Bronfman, Brenners, and others. And so we are thinking about, students, their immediate systems, but also the environment in which they're embedded, the policy environment, the larger social context. So we get a chance to think about kind of a 3-dimensional approach to where students are and how they're learning. So putting these ideas together, Michael Woodford and Jess Jocelyn and I combined them into a model to understand LGBTQ college students. And full disclosure, Michael, I still have the incorrect citation on this. It should be Woodford, Joslin, and Renn, but sorry. And we're going to start with the environment. Most of the people on this webinar are people who think about college students in their environments, right? We get what we get when they come in the door, and then once they leave, we don't have as much access to controlling the environment afterwards. But the environment that students are in. So in an environmental context model, thinking about LGBTQ plus people, there is in the institutional context the historical legacy of inclusion and exclusion. Then there's compositional diversity. And these are ideas that come from Sylvia Hurtado's framing of, and colleagues' framing of campus climate, right? So historical legacy, how visible are they? How do we see them on campus? Who are the models, the heroes in the campus context for LGBTQ people? Compositional diversity, this is simply, how many are there? This is a very complicated question for 2SLGBTQ plus student data, because most campuses don't have these data specifically. We don't actually know exactly who they are and how many. The environment also includes policies that are inclusive or maybe not inclusive. Academic and co-curricular programs. Is there a queer studies academic program? Is there an LGBTQ plus center on campus? We think about faculty attitudes and behaviors, what's happening from the instructors in the classroom and from faculty mentors outside the classroom. And then of course, peer attitudes and behaviors. So those are all part of what's happening in the institution. But also in that institution, students are having experiences of engagement and inclusion and exclusion. And these ideas come a bit from the work of Vincent Tinto and thinking about the ways in which students engage on campus. And so there's academic engagement, formal and informal. So formal would be classes, informal might be through like an organized research team, that's maybe semi-formal. And then the social context they have on campus. And then they're experiencing inclusion and exclusion, both the psychological climate, the ways that they bring their fears, hopes, and expectations that interact with the environment around them, and then also the behavioral climate. This is where students might be experiencing negative or positive behaviors towards them. So that's kind of the environment in which Michael and Jess Joslin and I kind of situated LGBTQ plus students. And then we think about what are the inputs. So we're going to this input environment, and we'll get to the outcome part in a minute. So thinking about the inputs, students are bringing with them a set of academic goals, how well prepared they are for post-secondary education, family support, peer support. Obviously, in the last few years, we've had to think a lot about the inputs, including the pandemic effects in that for students who were locked down, locked out of their secondary schools. How are they coming to us in higher education now? They've also, before college or before university, had some LGBTQ plus experiences for the most part. They've experienced a psychological behavior climate, whether or not they identified as LGBTQ2S plus at the time, they've been experiencing sort of this environment. And then they have their own identity and expression, which could be internalized, it could be externalized. Students come to us kind of from all ways, out, so the out and proud in high school to the ones that sort of get to college and sort of begin to figure themselves out, and some who probably make it through our environments without coming out at all. So these are the inputs in thinking about 2S LGBTQ plus students that come to our environment. And we were thinking about what are the outcomes that we tend to think about in general for students. Academic outcomes, do they persist to degree completion? What are they learning? We think about their mental health, psychological well-being. Think about their social and community outcomes, how they are connected to LGBTQ plus people, and then their own identities and expression. So working with, again, it should be Woodford, Joslin, and Renn in this source, we were looking at sort of the things that, how students make their way through. So some of these inputs have direct connection. How well you are prepared for university is going to have some effects on your outcomes. That's been shown empirically. But your academic will also feed into this larger environment in the middle. Same with LGBTQ experiences, those you've had before college will come into this environment, but some of them actually sort of have bypass effects. So they kind of affect the outcomes on their own. And then the same with LGBTQ plus identity and expression. So some of this comes right in, and then some of it will affect these outcomes at the far right of the screen. So we sort of see very complex interactions here across, and the whole thing is nested. The ground on which it sits. So this is not actually a title to this slide. This is actually national, state, and local socio-cultural historical context. It's not the title, it's actually the background on which it sits. It's the name of the place the whole thing is located, because these are all affecting students at the same time. So this is where we think about an overall environmental developmental ecology. So the student is in the college environment, brings their inputs in, but it's all sitting on this larger national, state, local, I would say international as well, sociocultural, historical context. So that is sort of the framing that we brought to trying to understand more about LGBTQ plus students. And when we were thinking about that, Michael just mentioned we've worked together for a long time. Michael, I think this is like our anniversary. I think it was the fall of 2012 when we first connected to start that 2013 study. And we started this 2013 study called the National Study of LGBTQ Student Success. Full confession, the nation in question there was the US. Michael at the time was here in Michigan with us. And there's other folks who've come into and been part of this study. They're at Michigan State, Laurier, the universities of Michigan, Iowa, Arizona, several other places that people who were part of the study have gone out to and been taking sort of some ideas and with them as they go. And we did sort of a large first study as part of this national study, and it was in the winter 2013. We used something called the Midwest Meeting of LGBTQ College Allies. The acronym is MumbleTech. It stands for all those letters in there somewhere. And it would happen to be coming to East Lansing. Michigan State was hosting it. So there were about 2,000 students coming to East Lansing, and that seemed like 2,000 LGBTQ identified students seemed like an opportunity too good to miss. So we were able to get about over 900 students to complete surveys. We also, during the weekend of this conference, conducted 60 interviews, the weekend and then sort of very shortly after. So it's a very ambitious kind of data collection process. And that would be what I would call sort of study one of the national study. And then study two, we started with fall of 2013. So the previous data was in winter before, so the following fall, we did a longitudinal panel of 20 incoming first year students at a large public university in the Midwestern United States. And we followed these students for 4 years. And we interviewed them 4 times each in years 1 and 2, and then several times after, had the same interviewee pairs. So they got to know the people a bit. Then we did some visual methods as well. During these interviews, we had them drawing heat maps and mapping their day through campus and bringing images. So it was really kind of fun and interesting way to kind of look at a longer process of data collection to get to know some students better. So those are all the things we did. So what did we learn? And keep in mind that kind of the IEO kind of framing of inputs, the experience, and the outcomes. All right, so we were focused on student success outcomes in general. We were focused on academic outcomes, their persistence, their knowledge, their competencies. Definitely, we were focused on mental health and psychological well-being. How are they doing? We focused on social and community. So the 2SLGBTQ plus and their ally relations. How were students doing in community? And then we looked at identity expression. Sort of to what extent were these identities integrated, internalized pride or stigma, the extent to which they were out in different contexts, and their resilience as well. So those were some of our kind of general student success outcomes there. And I'm going to talk now, shifting, to take some of these sort of in and talk about some of the studies that came out of it and sort of what we've learned in sort of the general big picture here. So first, a lot of our work was focused on climate. So there were climate measures in the survey. So we could think about how are students experiencing the climate, and then how is that affecting them? So we developed an LGBTQ college microaggression scale. We have studies that came out of it that look at some health behaviors and some mental health outcomes as well. These did tend to reinforce what was already in the literature and what we knew about some sort of negative effects of the more microaggressions students were experiencing, the more likely they were to engage in less healthy coping mechanisms or to use substances or to smoke, more depression and suicidal thoughts. So as much as we were trying to do a strengths-based, positive focused study, we still can't in the literature and in our lives and in our work ignore that microaggressions on campus and off are having negative health and well-being effects. And Mike will be talking about that later. So most folks on the call are not here to talk research. They're here to talk research to practice. So what do we learn from this? And thinking about sort of the studies out of this, it does seem that even though there has been a lot of training on how sort of microaggressions, how not to microaggress racially and other kind of categories, we still need to do continued training and awareness for student-facing staff and instructors. We have new folks coming in who may not have been thinking about this before. We need to continue to help people think through the ways they're sort of small, everyday, perhaps unintended vocabulary, gestures, visuals, the ways they're doing things are really continuing to be negatively affecting students Again, not intended, but the accumulated effect of the microaggressions being negative outcomes for students. And then also continued awareness and education for peers. I mean, there's a way in which I think it's really tempting to feel like, we don't need to still do the like panel awareness sessions of, LGBTQ 101, but helping students talk through what are the ways to interact in healthy ways. In my class last night, it's a master's class for students who are going to go into student affairs and student services. And we had a really healthy discussion about like, hold on, I read an article that came out in 2020 that talked using the word transsexual, but I was pretty sure that was not a word I should be using. And what words should I be using? And these are folks who are pretty aware of kind of how to be inclusive on LGBTQ plus student issues. And even they were like, I don't know what's okay for me to say, right? So they're trying really hard to stay on top of things. And I think that we have to continue to find ways to continue to talk with folks. And honestly, as vocabulary shift, things that ways students may be self-identifying may have changed, and folks who are working with them need to know what those changes are and how students sort of are calling themselves. So I'd say this continued education awareness for student-facing staff and instructors, as well as for peers, and then incredible vigilance for signs of distress. And this is part of what I believe we're seeing in the US right now, a substantial mental health, I think crisis is probably the right word at this point, among college and university students, and thinking about how can we be vigilant for these signs of distress? How do we use perhaps some of our academic colleagues who are doing academic work with students to help us, if a student is coming out, I know this in my work with them in the LGBTQ plus center, but then I hear from a colleague they've stopped going to classes, that's a pretty large red flag that I might want to think about. So thinking about vigilance and maybe connecting in ways we haven't always done out of the student affairs and student services space into thinking about how we can use some signals from the academic spaces on campus to help us interrupt and work with students who move from stressed microaggressions, stressful, into a distress space, so we can help things before that happens. So that's some of the ideas coming out of some of the climate work and some implications perhaps there. We also learned a lot about climate for communities. And one of my favorite studies came out by Z. Nicolazzo and Eric Pitcher, and I know Z is on the agenda, would be some work on trans kinship and thinking about the critical role of trans kin in creating space. So this is how students in our communities are finding each other, connecting, creating spaces, also thinking about how we, the implications of thinking about how we frame relationships and mentoring in communities. How do we help students locate the times and places to be together in kinship? How do we cultivate those in healthy ways? I think one of the implications also is that we need to understand more about who gets to participate in trans kinship networks, but who's being left out. What are the intersecting effects of racism, ableism, social class issues? So what are the ways that not all trans students in this case would have access to these kinds of kinship networks? And to the extent that other 2SLGBTQ plus students are also creating kinship networks, who's being left out and who's being included? I think it's really important to make sure that we don't assume they've all got their space on campus at this point, just because we see some who do have spaces. So that's sort of a climate around community. So we talked about interpersonal, and we talked about community. I want to think about the organizational context. There's absolutely, this is not surprising. This is one of these great social science studies that shows it's true. Affirming policies, programs, and support at any institutional type, and at community colleges in particular, all of these things actually work to improve student outcomes. Students feel more connected, they're more engaged academically, and they have better health and well-being outcomes when we have inclusive, affirming policies, programs, and support. I think that many of us who work in student affairs and services, and that was my career before becoming a researcher, intuitively it makes sense, right? If we have a center, or we have a staff person, or we make gender inclusive washrooms, all these kinds of things, we think it matters to students. Well, gosh darn it, there is evidence that it does. So it's not just a good idea intuitively, but it's true. And interestingly, in the implications, even for students who aren't using these programs, services, policies particularly, it matters to them as well. So having a student health insurance policy that includes gender affirming care, even for trans students who are not using it, or for non-trans students, the fact that that policy is there and people know about it is helping overall 2SLGBTQ plus students understand that they are supported on campus. So I think that even when students aren't using the programs and services, knowing they're there has a positive valence for them. I think partly that the organizational context there helps create ecosystems of visible support. We begin to see campuses knowing, where do I go to get help on this? Oh, there's a person there, there's a policy here. And then also ensuring that students can access support as needed. And again, kind of coming through and out of the pandemic, out, if that's the right, out of the pandemic, into the endemic, making sure that students can access the support as needed has been really critical. Thinking about, not only do we have it there, but can students physically access it or access it digitally or take advantage of a policy? So I think that's a real key piece of this organizational context. But the very happy news, unsurprising to most of us working in this area, but darn it, it really does matter. And yes, so that's good. There's a lot of things we do with student affairs and services that seem like good ideas. We don't have proof, but they sort of seem like it, but we actually have some evidence this is working. We also, I'm going to turn a bit of a corner here, we in the US national study have looked at some thriving contexts, not at all in the same way I know Canadian campuses are thinking about the concept of thriving. Thriving hasn't kind of taken off in the imagination of US universities quite yet as a way of thinking about health and well-being of students on campus, as I know it has, particularly in Ontario. But we have been doing some work out of the US data, thinking about where are students thriving. And we are finding places in the institution, academically, socially, wellness, and they're also thriving at home. For some students, this is particularly in our longitudinal study, we do find that they're thriving in their families of origin. Some really charming sort of stories coming out of the data of a student who came out to the family and at first was very rough and didn't go well, but then most of the other people in the family had gone to the same university and they were having like a homecoming sort of event, like a big US football game homecoming kind of thing. And all of a sudden, it was more important to the family that the student was like part of the team than they were like LGBTQ. So there was this sense that the family was like, well, you know, we have this other way of connecting, and that student was sort of brought in through that realm. There's an irony in the US that that a large US football game would be what brings a queer student kind of back into their family of origin, but that's what happened in this family. It was sort of a lovely way of reconnecting for that family. So people are thriving in families of origin and also their families of choice. And then when we think about in the research and practice of sort of what it means to think about queer student thriving, you know, reframing student experiences away from deficits into strengths. And that's a lot of what the Thriving Project over these next 3 days of seminar kind of series will be talking about. What are the ways that we're not going to ignore the negative health and well-being outcomes, but also really think about where are the strengths. So, and this is a shift in research on this minoritized population, right? Like it's not just things are going badly, but what is working, what is going well, and then how do we pour more energy into that? So the thriving studies are beginning to connect intersecting identities of race, social class, first gen, and ability, thinking about where does queer thriving connect into these other identities, social identities on campus. And then there's some, the November 24 keynote in this series is going to look at understanding how 2SLGBTQ plus students themselves view thriving. The research team asks students directly, and they have some really interesting ways of thinking about thriving. So look for that on November 24. Hints of coming attractions for thriving. Talk a bit about sort of what we're learning in academic contexts. There's been some studies specifically in STEM, so looking at LGBTQ STEM majors and the ways that they are both invited in with their identities, but also there is the stereotype that STEM contexts and are sort of identity-free spaces, because what they study is not about people. They are, so this tension there around sort of how do you bring a STEM identity in when it's a place where people are not often talking about identities. Bryce Hughes at Montana State University in the United States is doing a lot of work in this space as well. We've done some work on the role of faculty, and again, this is one of these delightfully unsurprising social science studies where, yep, it does turn out that when faculty are actively or sort of microaggressively saying discriminatory things in classrooms, this has a negative effect on students. But the many, many ways that faculty, queer and non-queer, can connect are really important. And thinking about how do we sort of leverage identities to motivate and engage students. So stories of I was a little nervous to tell my professor I wanted to do my research paper on the history of XYZ queer thing. And my professor, who's not queer, was so excited, and they really reinforced that. And that gave the student a passion and a way of connecting in. So thinking about how identities can be really leveraged by faculty to promote student academic success. And then Cindy Ann Kilgo, who's now at Indiana University, has done some wonderful work on the differential effect for LGBTQ students of what are called high impact practices. High impact practices were named by George Koo a decade, or well, 2 decades ago, and they include the kinds of intensive, usually academic related activities that involve faculty, involve deep engagement. They are shown to lead to strong both learning but also cognitive development. And it's things like service learning, a study abroad, undergraduate research. Those kinds of activities are said to be high impact on students. And it turns out that in the data that Cindy Ann has analyzed, they found that not only do LGBTQ plus students tend to participate at slightly higher rates, they also have disproportionately strong positive outcomes. So it's like an amplification effect when 2SLGBTQ plus students find themselves in high impact practices in settings that are identity affirming. So this would be, again, like that undergraduate research opportunity, doing something, doesn't have to be queer related research, but in a setting that the queer identity is embraced, can have a disproportionately positive impact on queer students, more than their cis and heterosexual peers, which is kind of cool. There's also differences based on outness, social acceptance, and participation. So this is where students will sometimes encounter a negative setting in a high impact practice, and that can be diminishing of that outcome, but also their future participation. So I think that thinking here about how do we leverage 2S LGBTQ plus identities to motivate, involve, and engage students in academic settings, but then also some continued education with instructors about how we help them be aware of the changing landscape. So campuses that are now allowing students to identify their names separate from their legal names, or identify their pronouns, like helping faculty, instructors understand why those things are happening, why they matter, helping them to learn to do that correctly. Those kinds of implications, I think, can help us avoid some of the microaggressions and move towards really leveraging these positive academic outcomes that we tend to see. This is my last kind of slide like this. So one of the things we found out of the study in the US is really redefining student success. And we've done some work asking students in the longitudinal study, we asked them to bring an image. What does student success mean to you? These kinds of things. And students talked about student success to me as a queer student means making a difference, creating a better space to leave behind for the students after me. It means my academic achievement. I did really well in a class, and that was really important to me. That's student success. To me, student success is quote unquote being who I am. So part of the work I do at Michigan State Universities with our undergraduate education office, and it's around student success defined mainly in very traditional terms of increasing our persistence rate, helping students move to graduation, finding the right major and career path they want to be on. But for students, success is a lot of other things along the way. And thinking for me as an administrator, the administrator little piece of me, the implications are how do we think more inclusively about what student success is? Yes, persistence and grades are important, but I want to expand that and have my colleagues talking in new ways about what student success is. And for queer students, what is student success, right? So it's academic, personal, social, leadership, and more. And it may be, a queer student's student success may include many very similar things to non-queer students, for sure, but there may be particularly queered aspects of that are important to them. So that was a lot of stuff to talk about. I want to bring us back to kind of thinking through where we as educators and staff and administrators connect. We don't always have a lot of, there may be some admissions counselors or officers in the listening group, but the rest of us don't have a lot to do with kind of the inputs that students are bringing with them. But we do have a large impact kind of in the center of this screen, thinking about what are we doing in our spaces to educate, make more inclusive, broaden things out. And then I want to think about sort of a lot of this research I just talked about and how we're going to directly move it to practice in the context of the environment. So thinking about the historical legacy of inclusion exclusion, what do I actually know about the history of LGBTQ2S plus people at my campus? Do we have faculty who've been out over years? What do I know about the student organizations? What do I know about the visibility and the presence? And then how can I make that more visible? How do I help people understand that context? So the next one, compositional diversity, data, data, data. Most of our campuses, as I said, don't have specific data on numbers of LGBTQ plus people. We don't know who our 2SLGBTQ plus students are, or staff or faculty. We need to work and advocate within our data systems to find places where we can do this, so that we can understand more about who's here, but also how are they doing. We do this in the US with underrepresented minoritized, racially minoritized students. We can compare kind of persistent success rates. We don't know that for our for 2S LGBTQ plus students. We literally have no idea. Of course, inclusive policies as part of our environment. I strongly recommend to people doing policy audits. And this is very straightforward, can be kind of fun. So very straightforward. You think about a process a student has to go to, applying to the institution, or applying through for their campus housing, or sort of some other thing that policy touches, right? And you go through and you look at every single policy with a very clear 2S LGBTQ plus lens. Where in this policy would outcomes be different for 2S LGBTQ plus people, and how do we change that? So there's some very obvious ones: healthcare, facilities, gender-focused facilities, but there's other policies that we might not think about, and names and pronouns could be one of these. Like how does a student actually change their name in the system? And where does that name show up and not? We've been working on this at Michigan State, and we learned, students kept going into the system and changing their name. Great. And then it kept getting changed back on class rosters to their dead name. And it took a lot of hunting and searching on campus till we found out that our employee HR system, which has to use legal names for federal Social Security reasons, that system happened to override the academic system. Nobody knew that until we figured out that, like, every time a student changed their name in the academic system, which was the registrar where their records were kept, where we were happy to use their names and on class rosters, but the other system kept overriding. So any student with a campus job, their legal name kept overriding. So that was a policy audit to figure out where and why is that happening. So really understanding how things are working inside your policy, doing policy audits. And it doesn't have to be the whole campus. You can start in your own office. What am I doing that's forcing students to have to make choices here? Academic and co-curricular programs. So doing an academic review, where are students able to find 2S LGBTQ plus places to connect in the curriculum formally, whether it is coursework, but also within classes. Do we have a cluster of classes that we know that students are going to have an option what they take? What about these service learning courses? How do we do that? And then, of course, co-curricular programs and services review. Not only what are we doing specifically on 2S LGBTQ plus student support, but what's happening for these students in the health center, what's happening for them in the student activities area, what's happening in recreational sports. So going through kind of all the different areas for this kind of audit. And also doing faculty and peer attitude studies. So this is not just campus climate for students, but understanding how our faculty and peers are thinking about these issues. And this kind of harks back to very early research. Before campus climate studies were done in the 1980s, there would be studies sort of about LGBT, what are your attitudes about LGBTQ plus students and issues? It may be time to revisit some of those so we can get a better sense of really where are people these days. So that would be some how to go research to practice kind of in those parts of the environment. And then I think that as we look at student experiences, I'd love us to use administrative data. And by this, I mean, are there places and ways that we are collecting administrative data on campus that could be used to understand more about LGBTQ plus students' engagement? This would be like an online learning system, for example. I could know if I knew who my 2S LGBTQ plus students were, then I might be able to understand literally, are they signing into the course site as often? Now this gets into a whole potentially icky surveillance-y feeling for a lot of us in student affairs and services. And I actually have a whole totally non-queer related study about how student affairs and services folks think about student data privacy. But I do have a friend at another institution who does a lot of work on persistence. And what he says is institutions have he makes a moral argument, actually. He's a theologian. No, religious studies was his PhD, not theology. But anyway, he makes a moral argument that we have so much data that we don't use, and we have a moral argument to use more of our data in ethical ways to identify students who are struggling and moving into distress, who could be leaving us. What are the signals we pick up in these administrative data? So there actually could be ways that we could think about this. I'm happy to talk more about administrative data, but it's not the focus here, but I think we could learn more about it. Doing studies of student experiences as well as climate, just so that we understand, like, are the 2SLGBTQ plus students we know, are they engaging in high impact practices? Are they seeking mentors? Are they finding these kinds of connections on campus? Just so that would be sort of important to know. So experience studies, not just climate studies. And then finally, climate studies. So to understand the psychological and behavioral climate, I think part of this is sort of asking queer folk how they are experiencing the campus. And I would say also doing observations. So it's not just asking people, but it's things like, I had a student once do a graffiti audit on campus. So it turns out that many college and university campuses have graffiti cultures, particularly in restrooms and washrooms, it turns out, public. And what we found out at Michigan State University is that the washrooms that were men's identified were filled with homophobic graffiti, just filled with it. Now, this was not true of the women's washrooms, which actually turned out to be filled with quite empowering conversation written in Sharpies on the walls. But what a great, interesting way to study climate compared to, in addition to kind of surveys. So thinking about what are the kinds of observations we can do on campus where we could learn more about kind of what our climate is. So, second to last slide. When we think about an ecological, multiple dimensions of identity approach to 2SLGBTQ plus student success, thinking about that in a holistic, ecological way, it opens possibilities for how we redefine success and how we redefine thriving. This kind of an approach lets us see students in their wholeness. It helps us understand student challenges as environmental factors, not problems located in the individuals. We're not here to fix the queer kids, right? We are here to change our organizational culture and our structures and our policies so that they are more inclusive. There's a lot of talk about 2SLGBTQ plus students and resilience. Like, what are we doing in our environment to make it that they need that much resilience to get through, right? So reframing that, flipping that thinking. What are we doing to be more open so that they can make their way through as others? And then opening eyes to see joy, right? I am all about these days the 2SLGBTQ plus joy, without ignoring negative and microaggressions, macroaggressions, discrimination, and negative health and well-being and academic outcomes. But I think we also need to see some of the joy, right? See the ways that students are creating spaces and celebrating themselves, their being. And I think it's a really kind of important next step in research. We're starting to see it in the US in some studies of Black college students, so Black joy on campus. And I really encourage us to think also about some of the LGBTQ plus joy. So I have got a few minutes for questions and discussion. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm maybe going to be relying on my friends to help moderate what questions to come in first and things like that.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. And we do have a couple of questions. Just to remind folks, in terms of asking questions, if you could use the Q&A feature, and I'll work our way through some of these. So please enter your question in the Q&A, and we'll look at that. And we will be turning over to Simone then after this part of the Q&A. So we've got a couple of comments. One is, where can I find more information about the study regarding student data privacy that was mentioned?
I will, I have a report on that and working on some articles on that, and I'm just trying to think the most effective way to get it to you all. Perhaps while Simone is speaking, I will grab the URL and I'll make that available in the question and answer spot.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts on administrative data and the role within student life. Perhaps later, for later, or would you be open to sharing key authors and some of those recommended articles? So maybe that's something else you could follow up on such. How in states like Florida can we show more support for students without being overt? First,
I'm really sorry, Florida, but for those who don't know, the in the state of Florida, the state legislature has gone hard after sort of into a don't say gay kind of direction. Sorry, that's a terribly short version of what's the horrible things happening there. And it's not just Florida. I am one governor's election away from that in the state of Michigan. Things are really quite precarious, as I use the term for climate. So I think that I don't know to the extent to which that speech is limited to what you actually say and what words are actually used versus visual images. So I think that one thing we need to lean into is potentially how we visually represent inclusiveness. Again, maybe a rainbow flag is also forbidden, but thinking about how do we do that. And then I think that we may need to switch into a little more coded kind of language again. I mean, it feels again like the 1980s, but how we indicate to students that we are safe people to talk to, that we are maintaining that. I think modeling for students that to the limits of our own ability, and this ability will change depending if you're a tenured faculty member, a staff member at will employed, things like showing students what it means to work within the limits of your ability to try to make change in these things, I think is important. And again, that within the range of it. And then there's nothing there that says that students themselves are not allowed to talk about these things. And I think this could be a time to begin to engage our tenured faculty colleagues and our student activists in ways to speak out and bring some attention on campus. It's the best I have at the moment for that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Another question here. Has there been any research on communicating the supports for 2SLGBTQ students? How are students finding out about these supports? How would they prefer to find out? For example, when they're looking at orientation, or in orientation when researching schools, is it finding out from friends, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think that the research I've seen, and particularly on students transition to college, like how they're finding colleges and universities are open, like it's all on internet, like they know to search. So one thing is to make sure that whatever terms you're using on your campus are easy to search for in the campus thing. Like do it yourself, like type in 2SLGBTQ+, type in LGBT, like try a bunch of different ways you think that somebody on your campus is going to look for the information and search your own. And if it's not coming up, make some changes or do some tags on web pages to make sure that's coming up, because this is definitely the way they are. Making sure that programs and services for 2SLGBTQ+ students are included in the kind of laundry list. Whenever we trot out our DEI laundry list, it's right in there. So students sort of know that and hear it. And even if they don't hear it or need it at the time, or for themselves, they'll know it for a friend or they'll know it for themselves for later. I think those are a couple ways of the visibility. And then I can never keep track of which social media traditional age college students are using now, but find it like we've got a Discord server that's very a thing among our queer students on campus that apparently people find their way into from other Discord servers. I literally have no idea how that works. But I think that finding how searchable you are, because they are searching on the internet, is a huge key to this, the findability.
Thank you. Yeah, I fully agree. I think that outward facing information and doing that kind of review of our website web presence is really, really important. Anything else you could say about the administrative data part you referenced?
Oh yeah, so there's so much administrative data that we in Student Affairs and Services haven't thought about. But here's an example. There's a study at the University of Iowa, not queer specific, but they looked at dining hall swipes and they looked at clusters. So they could identify students who seemed more isolated or more part of friendship groups, because if Chris and Michael and Eric and Corey always swipe in together, that says something about like they've got some kind of a social group, right? But if Simone never swipes in with anybody, maybe not that I have to like go find the loners, but like this could become a flag to pay attention to. That kind of administrative data. Again, that's a non-queer example, but kind of a powerful one. And there's some controversy about that stuff too. But thinking about how we could leverage academic engagement data for sure, the sort of the daily breadcrumbs students are leaving in their lives. And I really fall on a very complicated ethical place with this. So I'm both advocating for it and so cautious of it at the same time. But student affairs, we have some places keep student organization registry lists. These are some ways to, have we ever tried to connect that data to student like academic persistence data. So just thinking about the data we have, housing data can be very helpful as well. You know, again, this is so surveilly. Again, don't come at me for surveillance on this, but like, oh, I've got a student who never swipes their residence hall card ever on a weekend. So they're probably maybe going home, they're going someplace else on the weekend. You know, if I look over time and notice that students who never swipe on the weekends are way less likely to come back for their second year, it's not that I want to stop students from going home on the weekends, but maybe it's a way to, you know, surge some RA connection during the week to like talk to those students and see how they're doing. Or so again, don't say Chris Renn said we should surveil all the queer kids. I promise that's not what I'm saying, but I am saying to open our eyes to what could be done and then make ethical choices about what we want to do to serve students better. That's my case.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that, and I appreciate the complexity of that very issue and how do we use administrative data for what purposes and even what's available. And so you know, it is very much an emerging area, I think, for many of us. So